Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files.
Ooh.
And Louie, Louie, you're there already. So good to join you again.
I did actually have the X-Files theme tune prepared for this one, but I wondered if it was copyrighted and going to cause us trouble. So we could do. That's my rendition.
Is that it? That sounded more like Trumpson, I think.
That was my attempt. So there you go.
Close to the mark. Well, that's very good then. So insert theme music of your choice at this point.
I mean, sorry, that sounds like a fairground ride to me.
Well, maybe it is. Maybe we're all on just one big fairground ride. And given that we have an additional voice in it, it sounds like it's time we should introduce. We have got a guest today.
Yeah, this is we are joined by yet again another guest. I mean, listeners to the podcast may realize that Matt and Louie have stopped talking to one another alone, but we are still inviting guests.
It's like speaking to the children.
Yes,
tell your father. Although I was thinking recently, I again, it's really important to have guests. I think when we have guests, we
hello.
Who's that?
Hello.
It's the clock chiming, I'm afraid.
Time's moving on. Come on, guys.
Yeah.
Time is money. How long's the what's the time then? Oh, 10 o'clock. Okay, was that right? Yeah. About 10
yes.
o'clock.
10 o'clock. There you go.
I think that's slightly slow, isn't it?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
But there you go. That's analog.
An old lady.
Don't talk about Louie like that. So, what were we talking about then? Okay, so what were we talking about?
I think we're going to introduce.
Today
we are introduced by another psychologist. I seem to feel that we've had a bit of a run of psychologists here. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we are joined by another psychologist, Matt Colburn.
Well, I would ask you, Matt. Would you describe yourself as a psychologist?
Well, I think it's more cognitive science, actually. I mean, there's a definite overlap, but cognitive science is a bit. It's sort of a combination of philosophy of mind, cognitive psychology, artificial intelligence, and a couple of other things that sort of, come together in a big mystical ball.
Because I want to say, because when I was thinking back, Matt, so we, I believe, first met something like 20 years ago.
It was.
It would have been like late 90s, when we would have both been doing our PhDs.
That's right.
I want to say the word bees.
That's right.
That's what you were quite heavily involved with bees, as it were.
Yes, I mean, it's sort of ancient history to me now, but my PhD was in cognitive learning in bumblebees.
I love the fact it's bumblebees as well. So are there other types of bees?
Well, yes, there are. I mean, they're different from honeybees.
Oh, they are different.
Put it that way.
There you go. See, that's why it's so important to have guests. I learn things like that, because I was going to say you're very much into honey, but so bumblebees then, and it was... Again, for a lay person, so Louie can understand, what was the point of that? Why? How is working with bees telling us something of interest from a cognitive science point of view?
That's a very good question. Basically, they were learning and memory studies. Bees are very good at finding their way to flower patches, places where they feed, and we were sort of investigating that in the laboratory using pattern discrimination. So a bee would fly out to a feeder place and they'd have a choice between two patterns. And we measured how fast they learned that. We were doing things on context learning, which was the idea that when a bee enters a particular part of the landscape, it memorizes various landmarks so that it knows where it is. And what they can do then is discriminate between specific patterns when they're in a particular part of the landscape.
Fair dues. And so you're looking at those kinds of abilities within bees with a view to then extrapolating to humans, or just understand this is how bees may operate. Nothing to do with kind of like, because there's quite some elements of comparative psychology, which is study how animals do it, and that may tell us something about how humans do it. But would that have been an aim there, or is it no, just looking at it, how bees would do this kind of stuff?
Well, I would say the main application was artificial intelligence, because we were doing things with neural networks to see whether we could simulate how the bees were doing things. And of course, neural networks are also used to model various aspects of human thinking. and psychology and perceptual processes like vision. So there is a crossover there.
Okay.
And
Go on.
Well, I was going to say, and I'm kind of reminded of my hero Darwin saying, the brain of an ant is one of the most marvelous atoms of matter in the world, perhaps more so than the brain of man. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting question to look at how these creatures, do such complex behaviors, which with so little, which is, I think, the marvelous part of the question. Would you say, Matt?
That's right. I mean, and you've also got to remember that a bee has almost 1 million neurons, and that's quite complicated compared with a lot of the simulations, neural network simulations that we were using. Things like neural networks are really popular now for things like machine learning, by the way. So I think some of the work we were doing, you can see various applications in things like Amazon, your sort of product lists and things like that.
And also maybe they're drones delivering you packages. I mean, you could have a simulated bee brain and a drone dropping off your package 2 minutes after you bought your package, I would imagine.
That's right. I mean, we weren't quite at that level. It was mostly theoretical, but I would think that you'd have to think about the similar sorts of machine learning. So that's quite a good question. If you're going to have a drone doing that, how would it navigate through a landscape or a city?
And one can say it probably can't do much worse than the usual DHL Yodel driver anyway. So
yeah, quite.
So my mind was going more to the question of, given some of the other topics that we've looked at over the podcast to date, one topic has been this the puzzle of consciousness. So I'd go to Matt and say, so I'll ask it in a very kind of blatant way: are bees conscious?
Oh, that's a $64,000 question.
Well, I'm assuming that I'm going to put words in Louie's mouth. He may agree or disagree. And he'd say, argue, they're not, quite clearly not conscious. Louie, would that be fair? As in, I say you're not, as in, because you've studied them excessively yourself, but just intuitively from your take on what we might guesstimate consciousness might be, how it might arise, you'd suspect that bees wouldn't be appropriately conscious?
Well,
or
should we put it into the kind of language we've used in previous episodes? I wouldn't count a bee as an existential being.
Oh, get that. I like that. Nice one.
Okay, this opens up a huge can of worms here. I think it depends.
Worms now.
Yeah.
Worms,
I think it depends on what you mean by consciousness, and that will differ according to who you ask. What I think this sort of leads us straight into a really tricky question about worldviews and where you think conscious comes from, how you think it sort of relates to the functioning of the brain, all those sorts of very, very sticky and difficult questions that, to be honest, I'm still wrestling with. What I will say is that I think that comparative studies are becoming increasingly important in understanding how our particular form of consciousness arose. So recently, I was looking at a book by John Mallett and Todd Feinberg called The Ancient Origins of Consciousness, where they sort of related the kind of consciousness that we have with a very specific evolutionary pathway that started about 540 million years ago in the Cambrian. And what they're suggesting is that it gradually built itself up layer upon layer. Now, I don't think that's the whole story. I think we've got to think about things like the hard problem. But I do think that that's an important component in understanding how we experience things. And whether bees have that kind of comparative experience, I think, is genuinely an open question.
And maybe quite reasonable to say perhaps they don't. That's not to say they're not conscious, but then this idea of bee consciousness would be very, very, very different perhaps from human consciousness, other type of consciousness.
But I mean, also, animals like the bees and the ants are somewhat distributed over multiple individuals. So in the same way that, you know, bacteria are single cells and our brain are composed of multiple cells, I mean, you could potentially envisage a bee colony as an organism rather than an individual bee, could you not, Matt?
Yeah, I think you could. And that, again, raises questions of emergence and just when you cross that threshold from an aggregation of individual units to a conscious unit. And that's a question in life, of course. You know, is a sponge an aggregate, or is it actually a true unified organism in the same way that we are? And these are really deep questions that I'm afraid I don't have easy or pat answers to.
We're okay with that, absolutely, and that's why it's, you know, even sometimes the questions go over my head, never mind the answers. So okay, so that's why it was useful for me to kind of ground. That's when our conversations that we were beginning many years ago. You were looking at bees. I was doing research in the psychology of luck, which we can have occasionally spoken about on this podcast.
Right.
But again, so you said that was somewhat ancient history. So you're not still studying bees. That's sort of the PhD work. Tell us then, kind of in a potted history of what's happened since, or where you are now in terms of where your interests are and what you find yourself sort of giving your attention to.
Sure. I mean, the primary, I'm not actually within an academic institution at the moment. I do a lot of freelance writing, and a part of that's fiction writing. I write science fiction and other things. And part of that is non-fiction science writing. And my current research interest is actually aliens, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But I also relate that to issues of consciousness as well.
Okay, go for it then. So at least on the SETI side of it then, where are we with that? Have we, I would have heard by now if we'd had found something, but is there, what's the deal going on there in terms of SETI? Is it something which is still very much as active as it's ever been? Is there kind of interesting things exploring? Where's their attention at the moment?
Well, in very general terms, it's actually, there have been some very exciting developments over the last few years, mainly because a Russian billionaire named Yuri Milner has started the Breakthrough Listen initiative. And what that means is that SETI is getting a lot more money than it ever has in the past. If you don't mind, I'll just back up and explain how I got involved with this.
Please do, yeah.
One of my tutors when I was doing my master's in cognitive science, we're sort of colleagues now, and I happened to find out that he was doing SETI work. This was about a decade ago. So, and I've always been interested in SETI and astronomy. You know, it's an interesting question, an exciting question. And he was doing work on pulsars. He had the idea that you can't just point a telescope randomly into the sky and expect to pick up a signal from an extraterrestrial. You might need to do what's called targeted searching, which means basically that rather than searching the whole universe, you try and second guess what the extraterrestrials are doing. Now, pulsars are very commonly distributed throughout the universe, and they're thought to be rapidly rotating neutron stars that have a very precise rotation time. They sort of emit sort of loud radio pulses. And he had the idea you might be able to use them as lighthouses. So an alien might line up basically, if there was a pulsar between the alien's home world and Earth, an alien might send a signal along that alignment. So it might be worth looking in the direction of pulsars to see if you can pick up any additional signals. And it turned out that he was a member of a group called the UK SETI Research Network. I think it was set up in 2013, which is an informal group of researchers. A lot of them are astronomers and physicists, but by no means all of them. And they have an annual symposium. And I did my first presentation this March at Manchester, which was a lot of fun. And they had all sorts of very exciting ideas flying about, and there was also a visitation from one of the Breakthrough Listen guys, who gave us a quick rundown of where they're at the moment.
Excellent. So what was your presentation? What was your presentation on that?
It was on. Well, there's an equation that one of the SETI pioneers, Frank Drake, came up with called the Drake equation, which is basically, it's a way to estimate how many intelligent aliens might be communicating in the galaxy. And the way he did that was he looked at various factors. So it's like the rate of star formation, planet formation, the number of planets in the galaxy, habitable planets. And he has one factor called the intelligence, which is where you you estimate the number of planets that might have given rise to intelligence. And my suggestion was that we need an extra factor, consciousness. And I think what I was trying to get at was that intelligence in the current version of the equation is very undefined, and that we've got all these debates going on about the nature of consciousness at the moment, and no obvious solution to a lot of them. And that at the very least, consciousness studies might be able to contribute in a very positive way to thinking about alien intelligence.
So I was going to say, I mean, funnily enough, my very first talk as an A-level student was I gave a little talk to my tutorial group, and I wrote the Drake equation on the board and gave them a little spiel about aliens, because back in the day I used to be quite into aliens. So for you, Matt, the I is important in SETI. It's the intelligent part, because obviously, I mean, we're probably quite likely to find bacterial life in our solar system within the next few decades. I don't think that's would be unlikely. And we're possibly likely to find, plants on other planets outside of our solar system with the planet finding missions. But you're interested in intelligent life, not just bacteria and trees and chlorophyll and things. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think astrobiology, which is the general study of life in the universe, is a very important discipline. And it's funny because because of doing this research, I've been doing quite a lot of reading in it. It's amazing how much it's grown up in the last decade. I think you're probably right about the discovery of bacteria somewhere in or single-celled organisms somewhere in the solar system. I think the consensus at the moment, although no one's sure, because obviously we haven't found even a single alien bacterium yet, but I think the consensus seems to be that microbial life might be very common in the galaxy, that complex life is probably quite rare for a number of reasons, and that intelligent life might be rarest, intelligent communicating life might be rarest still. But at the moment, I don't think we can say absolutely for certain whether or not we're alone in the galaxy. I think it's one of those open questions.
And by that, using that phrase then, alone in the galaxy, as in things like us, things that are comparable enough to us to say, and that's where you mentioned this idea of consciousness again.
That's right.
And intelligence, something that you would say, actually, we could recognize as a life form in the way we imagine aliens, as in something that has that level of complexity and intelligence.
That's right.
And I'm also fascinated, again, Louie will love this for me, that I'll see it as a coincidence. I love the fact that one of his first, if not his first presentation as an A-level student included the Drake equation. And we find ourselves talking about the Drake equation. Again, purely reflecting your common interest in aliens. So again, Louie, you say at one time you had that interest in aliens. Still so, or would that interest, was it at the time, again, maybe as a late teenager like all of us, thinking, we sort of speculate on surely we're not alone, are there aliens out there? Was it that kind of interest, or is that interest kind of changed in some way?
I think it's almost untenable for us to be completely alone in the whole universe. I mean, the universe is not a human being making machine. I mean, that to me is just an untenable hypothesis. And so there must be intelligent life in the universe if if only archaeological remains. I mean, you know, the universe is a very old place, and whether we exist at the same time is another question. I think the question I was interested in when I was 17, for example, was, are there, you know, and this is the X-Files at the beginning, is that, are there aliens visiting the planet? And I know that when I was 17, for example, I was absolutely certain that aliens were running the world, and it was aliens, the CIA, and you know, Saddam Hussein was going to blow up the world, and aliens were in control, and the X-Files was real, and Area 51 was real, and I subscribed to all of it.
Area 51 is real.
Yeah,
it's just a question of whether there are any aliens there.
Yeah, but I was absolutely certain that they had a few UFOs parked in there, that they had a few UFOs parked in the pyramids, you know, and I subscribe to all of that. And I guess we throw the question to Matt Colburn. So SETI out there in the universe, yeah, visiting the planet?
Well, I thought this question would come up. It's quite funny, actually. If you want to annoy an astronomer, you go up to them and you ask what their star sign is, and then you ask whether they're interested in UFOs. Honestly, it works every time. Try it. It's very funny. Anyway, when I actually resonate with you a bit, Louie, because when I was 13, I was really into the whole UFO thing. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? Basically,
yeah,
UFOs.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think it was weird, actually, because I kind of had an evolution. So I started off pretty much like you, like thinking there are these literal nuts and bolts creatures coming along. But there was actually a school of thought. It's called the psychosocial school of thought, which basically tries to explain UFO experiences in terms of people's psychology and in terms of social and cultural factors. And I think that's basically where, you know, I evolved that as I grew up, and that's basically where I've sort of stayed. I think the whole UFO thing is definitely worth studying from a sociological and cultural point of view. There's no question. But I also think that the evidence that's presented for extraterrestrial visitation is thin in the extreme. You know, I just don't think it's there.
And I think I've discussed before on the podcast my own personal UFOs that I've seen and were, you know, turned out to be mundane. But, you know, people do have experiences which stimulate these sightings. But, I mean, I must admit, I don't believe there's any good evidence for extraterrestrial visitation to the planet. But, you know...
I'd agree with you, Louie. I mean, I think we need to acknowledge the power that some of these experiences have on people. I happened to read a piece quite recently about this guy who claims, you know, to be an abductee. And although reading through it, it's pretty subjective, really. I think there's a lot to the sort of idea that what we're talking about here is sleep paralysis and, you know, the sort of things that anomalistic psychology deals with. I think it's more like that sort of thing that's going on. But when you actually read these things, I think you need to acknowledge that they have a very personal, subjective power. But I don't think they have anything to do with aliens.
I mean, I was going to say that had I not explained my mundane experiences, you know, had I not understood what they were, I would still to this day believe that I had been you know, had experienced an alien visitation, UFO, whatever. So I mean, they can be very, very powerful.
Oh wow! So what was your experience?
I'm sure. I mean, Matthew Smith will have to remind me. I'm sure we discussed this previously.
We probably have. But if you ask me to remind you the details, that will assume I would have listened.
Well, okay. I was looking out my window. My flatmate said, "Louie, the UFOs are landing." I look out the window. There's a big, huge thing, black, dark shape with flashing lights around it, hovering over the houses. I shit my pants. I try and keep calm though, and I realize it is the Virgin Richard Branson UFO balloon.
Oh, right. Okay.
But I mean, you know, had I not realized that, then I would be I would have been at odds at explaining that experience, because it was literally a large black dish-shaped object with flashing lights around it, not far from where I was. So
it's remind me. So the context there is Branson and his crew. Is it an active hoax? Were they trying out technology, or was it?
I think in the 1990s he was flying it around to just as a joke. Yeah, I think it was advertising Virgin in the media, you know, the brand, and you know, it was kind of Cool Britannia 97. You know, Loaded magazine was on the shelves. The Spice Girls were still releasing records, and he thought it was good for a laugh, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think actually, Matt Coleman, that's the year we met. I think possibly. I think
it was 90. I think it was 1998.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Quite good. Let's crowbar to 97, where all the magical things were happening. But I love the fact that it was actively duped by it. But and given that actually from the experiential side of it, given that because also we know that lots of the sightings of UFOs, either if they're not hoaxes, they are, you know, people sort of seeing even unusual shaped clouds or lights in the sky. If you're going to see something, you actually saw what was essentially a UFO. It was a clear object designed to look like an alien spacecraft.
Well,
so lo and behold.
My other one is I saw a silver dish in the sky. It was literally a silver dish. It was bright, you know, small. It was, you know, a large silver dish-shaped object. And again, this wasn't Richard Branson's UFO balloon. What was it? It was a seagull that had caught the bright sunlight and was shining great silver. You know, and again, had I not seen it turn and I then recognized it as a seagull, I would be left saying, well, what was it? I have also, and one of the great UFO, you know, stimulating objects is Venus. And if you ever see Venus in the sky bright, or Jupiter in the sky bright, they do appear to follow you. And again, I do think that you know, Venus and Jupiter can be exceedingly bright in the night sky, and do appear to follow you when you're traveling. And no doubt some of the UFO reports in the literature are, you know, people following planets.
Yes, I think that's actually right. And another one I'd add that's more recent is the International Space Station. If you look out, there's a great website called Heavens Above, which predicts passes, but basically it orbits above the Earth, and you can usually see it if you go out after dark and look south, and it crosses from west to east, and it about 3/4 of the way, if you're looking not long after sunset, about 3/4 of the way across the sky, it fades. And the reason why it fades is because it goes into Earth's shadow. But if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd see a very bright object traveling reasonably fast, very high up, that just disappears.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the space station, and it is spectacular and travels very fast, and again is a very unnatural object, and again can stimulate, no doubt, stimulate some people saying, "Oh my God, what have I seen?" So.
That's right, and also Japanese, those fire balloons are notorious. I saw a couple, and they fooled me for a few minutes riding after dark once, and there are a couple of YouTube clips, I think, which definitely, they very clearly show these sorts of floating, they're balloons with flames, little hot air balloons, basically. They're very dangerous, a sort of fire hazard, but they're launched at parties and things. But there are a couple of YouTube clips, I don't know whether I could locate it again, where people are looking up and going, oh, I feel like this alien presence, I'm in the presence of an extraterrestrial, I feel really weird. And they're plainly looking at fire balloons.
I think a nice word that Louie described, we talk about unidentified, but these unnatural things. If you see something in the sky that looks unnatural, because often if you have, you know, sometimes say there are cloud shapes, but if they look unnatural, don't look what you would expect, then that's where people are obviously saying, well, I'm seeing something in the sky which actually doesn't look as though it should be there. And then, like with ghosts and other kinds of sightings, people say, oh, well, they start to put 2 and 2 together and come up with 5. But also, I suppose, going back to your mention there, Matt, of the psychological and sociological aspects as well, is that, of course, for millennia, we're looking up to the skies with a view to thinking, what's up there, and that's why we're obviously these UFOs are appearing in the, in quote, like you say, heavens above. They're up there, and you think, well, for many people, they're a sign of something. They're indicative of something greater, something bigger, perhaps aliens, perhaps something else.
That's right. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to substitute gods, really, because when you look at the sort of, I mean, it's a very jumbled UFO literature, but, you know, a lot of the time when you read what these aliens are allegedly supposed to be able to do, they have, you know, it's all allegedly done through technology, but a lot of it's very magical technology, really, you know. So I think in many ways it is a substitute for gods. Not really so much a, you know, single god, but it's more like a modern version of ancient Greek gods, I suppose.
and I was kind of thinking, I mean, you know, the Milky Way does look like a river in the sky. I don't think it's, you know, it is a bit of a weird thing, isn't it? You know, to look up and there be almost an analog of the Nile in the night sky. I don't think it's unreal. I don't blame the ancient Egyptians for thinking, you know, there's more going on here than just a load of stars.
Well, I think there's this sort of ancient sense of an ancient cosmology where you have, it's, you know, from shamanism and that sort of thing, where you have the world below, you have the underworld, you have the Middle Earth, the middle world, which is where we live, and then of course you have the gods in the skies. And of course, the shaman traditionally uses the sort of world tree to shuttle from one realm to another. And maybe that's what's interesting about abductees. Actually, there's a very messianic element in there, sort of very shamanic element, where I think people do genuinely see themselves as intermediaries between this world and a sort of another one. I get that from the writing.
And you're saying then, for Matt, that your own writing includes science fiction. So in terms of, and I'm not a science fiction buff, as it were, in terms of sub-genres within that, but would you say there is a certain general style to your science fiction? Is there a certain theme to it? Are there certain topics you're drawn to? Is there a particular general point you're making with some of your science fiction, or is it just whatever takes your fancy?
Well, I think I vary, because I write very, you know, fantasy-based stuff, and I've written a couple of some ghost stories, but also just general. But more recently, I've been writing science fiction, and the novel I'm writing at the moment is, or just trying to get finished off actually, is set about 150 years hence, and it's very much a science fiction novel. It's sort of about intelligent animals and artificial intelligence and star travel and all sorts of things.
And so you'll say just kind of the beginnings of that? Is that something you're starting on, or is it? I'm curious in terms of your process then of, do you know where that story is going now, or are you writing it and seeing how it evolves as you put pen to paper or as you type it out?
I think I've been writing it for about 3 years. It's been a very long, and I honestly don't know whether it's ever going to get published. But basically, I'm in the polishing for a beta read. So if you want to have a read, then you're more than welcome.
Well, I'm a very, very slow reader, so it'll probably take me 5 years to read. So if you want someone to do a quick read of it, then Louie may be a better person, or we can put out the request. I was also looking, because I know you had or perhaps still have your blog, Cosmic Citizen, but I went to look recently, but that's now a private one, is it? You only kind of invited readers to that one?
Yeah, I mean, my current blog is Matt Coburn Writer, and it's sort of very similar. Okay. But again, that's sort of ancient history, so I thought I'd do a completely revamped one. I can provide the website address if you want.
I'll link it in the show notes there, Matt. I was going to ask you, Matt, so if I could just kind of move the conversation on a little bit.
Sure.
I know we were talking a little bit off air about kind of why intelligent life might exist, and I kind of got the impression from you that there might be a divergence of opinion here, and I think it's something
Sure.
that, you know, is worth discussing on the podcast, because it's the kind of topic we talk about. But I mean, I was kind of reminded of the differences between, you know, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And Darwin saw evolution as a natural process that is not, you know, he famously said, what's true for the gnat is true for man. And I think it was, that's his, and I think he also, and Alfred Russel Wallace was a spiritualist, and he believed that, I mean, I think he basically believed that evolution was a process that is almost inherent in the universe to make intelligent beings, and it goes on after death and carries on. And
Right.
So, I mean, is the universe, I kind of got the impression from you, you're more of a Wallacer than a Darwiner. Is that an unfair?
I think we've got to be very careful here, because I actually taught evolution for a while. You know, sort of very mainstream neo-Darwinism at Sussex. It was sort of under another guy who'd actually designed the course, but. I think I'd actually want to reframe it, and I think part of the problem is that whenever alternatives to sort of the neo-Darwinism, which includes a materialistic reductionist worldviews, are presented, religion almost inevitably gets dragged in. And I think this sort of became clear when I read Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, where he's critical of what he calls a wide-ranging speculative world picture, which he calls materialistic reductionism. And I think he's actually not he's not interested in the God issue, but what he's interested in is whether sort of chance and necessity. Okay, let's just completely park those issues to one side. So the issue becomes, is chance and necessity, and what we mean by that is a combination of the laws of physics and neo-Darwinian natural selection, is that completely adequate to explain the complexity and richness of the world in which we find ourselves? And I think where I differ is I accept Nagel's argument that that's an open question, especially when you start thinking about issues of consciousness. But if you're asking me for a positive worldview, I'm not sure.
I want you to, we'll just continue that line of thought then. So you say, especially when you consider, so essentially arguing, or not arguing, but we're considering, and again, I'm more open to that perspective, but if I'm understanding the line of argument to the point where you kind of paused,
sure,
is that the question is, are those processes sufficient to explain everything? Not just the world, but the universe. The reason that, not say the reason why it's here, but how it emerges in the way it is.
Yeah.
And were you then sort of saying, well, it's an open question, meaning we don't know, but perhaps not, and especially if we're trying to include this messy thing called consciousness within it. Is that where you left it? Because you then paused,
yeah,
and then I wasn't sure. Okay,
I think I have to be quite. Yeah, I have to be quite careful here, because frankly, I don't want to get pilloried for having views that I don't actually hold. So just to be completely explicit, I come from this from I would actually define myself as an agnostic, because I don't have a strong, I'm quite existential really, in the sense that I don't have a strong belief or disbelief in many of the metaphysical schemes that people use for explaining the universe. I do genuinely try and stay open.
So just on that one, you and me both, Matt. So when there's an earlier episode where we explore, when I describe myself as agnostic, what I might mean by that and what agnosticism means.
I don't mean a weedy fence sitter. I mean that it's to me it's a position of exploration. I'm suspicious. I'm like a lot of people. I'm quite suspicious of the word belief, and I think maybe I'd rather see it as an active exploration of ideas. I think that's more constructive than sort of having this slagging match, frankly.
Yeah, and also not necessarily kind of where you're coming from. Is that, well, I'm not strong on I'm definitely here or here. I am genuinely willing to explore all of these kinds of topics, but as open as mind as one can be.
Yeah.
And then I always go back to this idea, again, because we've all, the three of us here, our shared interest in the past has been things like parapsychology. It's that kind of general area where we would have met each other and been at conferences and so on. And we're very aware, and maybe within that context, being either labeled as skeptics or otherwise. And then when people say, well, yes, you can have an open mind, but be careful your mind's not so open that your brains fall out. That's a very clever line. It's like, there's something also about being open to different perspectives, different points of view, and not necessarily having to kind of disagree with them or dismiss them, at the same time not having to then go, well, I'll wholeheartedly take that on board and accept it. It's like just hearing the different perspective and recognizing there's a myriad of perspectives out there, and sometimes we want to sometimes pigeonhole ourselves or others to say, are you atheist? Are you a believer? If you believe, what do you believe? Do you believe in this?
It's identity politics.
Okay, let me just. I'm just going to butt in a little bit between you.
Of course.
You weedy agnostics. I mean,
exactly.
Here we go.
Just for the sensible listeners, I mean, as long as you understand that, well, taking it back, let's go back to Chance and Necessity,
Sure.
and the great book by Jacques Monod.
Yes.
Was a Nobel Prize winning. I mean, hands
Sure.
up any of us here who've won Nobel Prizes, and this is not an argument to authority. But
sure.
The guy is looking at the machinery of the cell and finding nothing that needs further explanation. So I mean, if there were, I mean, we've had, when we had the episode about why does the universe exist, and I think we came to the conclusion that we really can't know why the universe goes to the bother of existing, because from my perspective, I would be very happy if there was just a naked void, and I would be sitting there rubbing my hands in glee saying, see, there you go. Right? But do we find a naked void? No, we do not. On the other hand, I certainly don't see, from my perspective, any need for me to posit intelligence. I certainly don't. And I can imagine an intelligent universe, can imagine a universe where I believe in an intelligence,
Sure.
And I certainly don't see that. So I think it's all very well being agnostic, but I also and saying, okay, I don't know either way. But the universe to me looks very inhospitable for life. It's very abiotic. It's a hell of a lot of space, a hell of a lot of effort to go through for a minimal amount of life. So I mean, from my perspective, and we started a little bit of discussion talking about chance and necessity, I personally think that there is a hell of a lot of chance for very, very unlikely things to happen, and from those unlikely things come even more unlikely things, such as existential beings like you and I.
Right.
And I think we are very, very rare in the universe. And in some ways, and I've said this quite a few times on the podcast, I think that actual existential beings share something that genetically related individuals do not, which is an appreciation of the nature of the universe. And I think we have far more in common with existential beings, whether they be a Neanderthal or another intelligent alien that has a similar experience to us, than we do with a chimpanzee or a cat or a dog. I mean, I feel more kinship with those creatures than I do with other animals.
So coming into the chance and necessity thing then, so that's why, Louie then, I think, making the case saying, well, actually, the chance and necessity is enough. It does explain it all, even the complex, even the things that it seems so unlikely it couldn't. But that's what I was just trying to just tease that. Matt, I'm not trying to push you into any kind of saying.
I'd like to. I think I can actually see where Louie's coming from to a certain extent, in that we're adapted beings to a very local environment, and that a lot of the universe, you're quite right, doesn't seem hospitable to our form of life at all. But that's because we didn't evolve elsewhere. We evolved in a very specific, on a planetary surface in a tropical environment, and we gradually increase that range throughout the world. But I'd like to reframe it in a different way. And I think before I do that, I'd actually like to go into why I think it's important to address this question. When I look around me in our culture, one of the big problems I see with people on an everyday level is alienation. People feel very alienated from each other. They feel alienated from their society. And I think most importantly, at a time of environmental crisis, they're alienated from nature. And I think one of the things that astrobiology has been showing me is how intimately connected we are with the universe. So, for example, okay, I'm not denying Louie's perspective, but I think an alternative way is say, look, we are very much at home in the universe where we are. our molecules, the carbon, there's a thing called the triple alpha process, which is basically when nuclear fusion at the heart of a star welds helium nuclei into things like carbon. Now, to me, that's an absolutely incredible, and it's one of the things that shows that we have this very deep past that relies on a lot of those apparently hostile processes to come into existence. And that's what I see when I don't look and see an existential void. I see the rest of the universe. I see the rest of nature. And I think, to be honest, that's what we need to focus on. One of the problems with sort of evacuating basically supernatural elements from the universe is, I think, what it left behind it in cultural terms. And I think Jacques Monod's book is a really prime example. It left behind an existential vacuum that I think really fails to tackle very serious and practical problems of alienation and human life. And I don't think, incidentally, that human beings can jettison purpose quite so simply. I really don't. I think it's a fundamental need, like sex or food.
Except, I mean, and I will just rebut that, Matt, and I thought what you said
Sure.
was perfectly reasonable. I mean, I'm an atheist. I currently counsel bereaved people in a charity.
Great.
And if I think what you're talking about is what we need to do is reimagine human being, not necessarily.
That's right.
And I think we could, if we actually took control of ourselves and rebuilt ourselves in a kind of Nietzschean, Übermensch, divorce ourselves from the past and recreate ourselves how we want to be. And I think actually removing those supernatural elements is part of the process from my perspective. Then I don't think that Louie's pointless atheist world isn't devoid of existential caring for one another in our darkest moments.
I think first of all, that's a really positive contribution you're making, Louie. It's very important. I think the point is that you can't, just because you don't necessarily believe in a God. I mean, I'll put it this way. I was looking at I looked at some of your articles on, there's no God, so there's no purpose in the universe. So I was thinking, my first thought was, so you actually need God to have a purpose, do you? and I think we can debate where purposeness comes from, whether it's an attribute of living beings or whatever. But to me, it's an act of creation, and that doesn't matter. That's okay. But it's also about that connection rather than purpose. Because when I go out into the natural world, I mean, I do have an unashamedly romantic approach when I go mountaineering or, beneath the sea, or into a wood. There is that sense. It's a very subjective sense of connection, but I believe that's very important. And I think one of the reasons why we're so happy trashing the natural world and causing a mass extinction is because we've lost that sense.
And I guess this is just a difference of worldview, as we've said at the beginning. I think differences of worldview, and
sure.
I mean that's how you feel. And I must admit, I mean, I've been joking all week that when I die, I want to take out a few, poison my body, give me to a few tigers, and hopefully I'll take out a few. Hopefully I'll take out a few extinct, or soon to be extinct creatures at the same time. But, differences of opinion.
And perhaps by then we'll actually include video on the podcast so we can get some good high definition footage of that.
You can
launch season 3 with that one, I think.
I'd just like to say that, assuming that there is no afterlife, surely that makes it very important to make the life that we do have for us and for other people as good as possible, So maybe that's a way of emphasizing it in a more positive way, that we, have to make the best of what we've got.
And certainly I wouldn't disagree with you there, Matt. And as I said before about, sharing a kinship with other existential beings, if an alien were to land on the planet, I think the two of us would be commiserating ourselves, each other on the absolute misery of existence, and that's how I always envisaged the first meeting of two existential species.
Although it may be that the alien arriving here saying, yeah, well, where you guys here on this so-called mostly harmless planet in the middle of nowhere, yeah, there's not much going on, but the stuff that I've seen out there, guys, get your spacesuits on and come and join us, because there's plenty more to see that you haven't sort of found yet.
I mean, we did fuck the Neanderthals, so probably we commiserate and then fuck, I guess, is the.
That'll be your epitaph, isn't it, Louie? You'll commiserate then fuck.
I commiserated and I fucked. Yeah, it sounds good to me.
I don't. Yeah, sure. Okay.
No, go, Matt. No,
I was going to say I don't understand why everything has to be so miserable. I mean, you know, even given I know plenty of people who are very staunch. I mean, it's like my work colleague, actually, very staunch atheist materialist. He's very engaged and anything but miserable about the life he has, you know?
By the way, I mean, I'm not miserable at all. I'm I'm a very jolly person. And as I say, working in a hospice, I'm the jolliest person there.
Yeah. Very constructive work.
However,
they're all a bunch of miserable so-and-sos there.
They are a bunch of miserable folks.
Cheer up, folks, for Christ's sake.
Cheer up.
It may never happen.
It could be worse. You could be dying. However, I will say I am a pessimist, and you know, I don't think that being pissed off, angry, upset at the nature of the universe as we find it, I don't think it's an unreasonable position to take. And
sure,
you know, and yes, we can all pat ourselves on the back and walk around as if the universe is a lovely place. But I don't think it's unreasonable to feel that the universe isn't a wonderful place. And again, you know.
Oh, I never said that. You know, I'm not denying the dark side in the least. And
but also.
Fact, you know,
I mean, sorry. I mean, but also, you know,
right.
our biology is not ours. You know, our purpose is not ours. We don't ask to be born, and you know, in some ways, our very selfhood is an illusion. And I think that to be somewhat pessimistic about the reality we find ourselves in is not unreasonable. Though to have a happy face, you know, to put a smile, to have a smile on your face at the end of it is, of course, a reasonable reaction, lest we be the butt of the joke of the universe.
Yeah, I think that's what you're talking about is the problem of evil, basically, and the dark side of life. And absolutely, you know, I'm not a sort of mindless Panglossian optimist. And, you know, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge the darker side of our nature and the darker side of existence. And I also, you know, I can't argue with it that there has been a strain of philosophical pessimism in the West for quite a long time. So it's a legitimate point of view, and there are times when life gets so miserable, I think that it's difficult to see anything else. But I think my only point really is that that's only part of the story.
And I wanted to just query and allow Louie to come back. So you used that term evil, but I'm not guessing that's where Louie's coming from. It's this idea of that, well, the universe doesn't give a shit kind of thing. So, and even in terms of more locally in the solar system, at some point the planet will fall into the sun. That's not an evil process. That's just natural, and It will cause the annihilation of the planet. Whereas, yes, we see that humans being horrific to other humans may be indicative for some people as evil. And those kinds of terrible ways of treating each other. But I'm guessing that Louie's more take on in terms of the universe being inhospitable, uncaring. It's not designed in a way to specifically support human life. It wasn't. That's why it's here. And in fact, plenty of signs around showing that the so-called tragedy you see from so-called natural disasters are ones where that just shows there's no real caringness going on here. Is that right, Louie? We'd be more that rather than sort of labelling things as being, in quotes, evil as such. Although, again, I think it'd be a great topic for us to discuss maybe in another podcast, those ideas of so-called good versus evil. But is that right, Louie? You wouldn't necessarily be buying into using those kinds of terms.
No, I think that anyone who wants to know what I think is welcome to go and read, my various essays and things. What I will say is that what we're doing now, existential beings discussing the nature of existence, is one of the great joys of life.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to sit and debate these things and chat about them. And I think this is one of the things that brings me a great lot of joy, even if the universe is pointless and meaningless and whatever, I think. And so I say thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Thank you,
And
Matt, especially.
And we'll say see you next time.
Yeah, bye-bye for now. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate you joining us. You've
No
stimulated
problem.
some more great thoughts amongst the mind of Dr. Savva. and
Dr. Smith, well. Obviously. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you, folks. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.